everyone, and happy New Year's Eve. Today I'm taking the cake from my last video, which was my cinnamon and almond cake, and turning it into a festive New Year's Eve cake. And so first I wanted to start out with my frosting. So I loosened it with some melted frosting to make it nice and smooth, and then I'm separating it out into 3 different tins to make 3 different colors. The colors for the 2021 are yellow, green, and gray, so that's what I'm going to make. I'm going to try to make these as pastel as possible. You see, I only used 1 drop of food coloring for the yellow. It turned out pretty bright, but that's okay. So I'm just going to mix this pretty thoroughly to make sure I don't have any big white patches, and then I'm going to move on to the green frosting. For the green, it's the same process. I'm going to add a drop of green, and then we're going to mix it thoroughly to make sure I have no massive white spots. I wanted this green to be a little bit more muted than what I was going to get with 1 drop of green. And so I did add later on a little bit of gray just to help it kind of tone it down. It turned it from this kind of light forest green to sort of a minty green, which is what I was going for, so that was great. With my 2 colors made, I want to make my 3rd color, which is gray. So again, 1 drop of black into white frosting. And I want it to be, again, fairly dull in color and fairly a light gray. So I want to do 1 drop at a time to see where I'm at. And I found this gray to be perfect, so I stopped here. Again, I found my green to be too bright, so instead of adding a drop of black and possibly ruining my green, I added a little bit of gray. I felt this added a little bit of coolness to the gray and made it a little bit more frosty, a little bit more minty, and a little bit less bright, which is what I was going for. I transferred both the green frosting and the yellow frosting into piping bags that were fit with couplers so I can change my tip out, and once these are all set, I'm ready to pipe. Here are the tips that I used to create this cake, and I will post the numbers down below. But first, I have to frost my cake in my gray. So I chose these colors because they are the colors of the new year, and so I figured a gray base would look really nice. And so similar to any other cake you're going to make, you're going to start from the top typically and push your frosting over the side and then frost the sides. I made a batch and a half of ermine buttercream, which turned out to be just enough. I had barely enough to cover this cake. So as you're going to see, I am definitely scraping my sides and scraping the bowl, trying to get the last gray I possibly can to get onto this cake. I think in the baking world, there are a lot of instructors that say scrape your bowls like it's your Christmas bonus, and I was definitely doing that. I was like praying for gray to appear out of nowhere. And so what you're going to see me do, instead of coating my whole cake and then using my bench scraper, I needed to use my bench scraper a little early to scrape off some buttercream to make sure I could cover all of my cake. This method was definitely unconventional, but I do have an appreciation for it because typically when I make a cake, I make a really big vat of frosting, like a double or triple batch, and I'm only covering a 6-inch cake, so I end up having like half of my frosting left over. And I'm not always sure what to do with it because I typically make about 1 cake a month, and so frosting, it can last that long, but sometimes I want a different color or different flavor, and so having just enough to what I could cover made sure that I was using every single bit of frosting that I could, making sure that I was getting even coverage with what I had, and it basically made me more aware of what I do as a cake baker and a decorator. So I have some appreciation for this. Will I do it again? Probably not. I think I will make myself a little extra buttercream next time. So as you can see, there are some white chunks in my buttercream, which ended up being chunks of butter. So I thought I had gotten all my butter whipped nicely, and I apparently did not. If this happens to you, you could technically scrape off all of the frosting and put about 1/3 of a cup in the microwave and then reintroduce that microwave frosting into the regular cold batch of frosting to help smooth it out. I did this in the beginning, I thought it had worked, and I probably didn't heat enough buttercream for it to all smooth out. But because I'm going to cover this cake in a lot of decoration, and because I think the white speckles make it look a little more vintage, and I'm going for a vintage look, I'm okay with it. But if this is happening to you and you don't like it, you can either scrape off all the buttercream and again reincorporate some liquid buttercream back into the colder buttercream, or if you have enough, you can also do a second layer and hope that all the butter is going to be on the inside layer, not on the outside layer. I'm working on a cake that's frozen, which means that my buttercream is setting pretty quickly. To help combat this, to help my frosting stay a little looser, I'm using a warm bench knife that I heat up in some boiling water. This is going to help get me those smooth lines and smooth sides and smooth top without having to add any more buttercream. Once you're happy with your coat of frosting, it's time to move on to decoration. I placed a 4.5-inch cookie cutter on the top of my cake so I can then mark out 8 even sections of my cake. I'm then using cookie cutter on the side of my cake to kind of mark out where my ruffles are going to be. As you can see, this took me a couple of times to get right, and so because this cake is cold, just use a palette knife that's either warm or cold to just smooth out the buttercream and make sure that you don't have any excessive lines. A lot of this is going to get covered in buttercream, but you don't want to have too many lines that you can't cover. After marking my half circles for the third time, I finally got it right. I was happy with that. It's time to move on to actually piping my ruffle. For my ruffle, I'm using a petal tip, and I'm just having the thin end pointed toward the cake, the thick end pointed out down toward the cake. And then I am basically putting even pressure and moving my hand back and forth in a half circular pattern to create this ruffle. I'm just going to repeat this pattern until I have all of my 8 ruffles. The beauty of this cake is that nothing has to be perfect because you're going to add so much decoration, likely no one's going to see your mistake. However, if you're unhappy, make sure you start first of all using a cold cake, because anything you mess up on, you can just scrape off and it won't stick to the buttercream underneath it, or at least it won't stick too much. And then you can use a little bit leftover frosting to just cover where that green or yellow used to be and then start over. And now that I'm on my last ruffle, it's time to kind of hide my seam with a yellow border. So I'm using a round tip, I think it's a 3, and I'm just gonna go and add some swoops to my cake to, again, kind of hide the fact that the ruffles start randomly in the middle of the cake. To keep this design very round, I'm not trying to touch the cake, except for when I start and stop my line. So as you can see, I put some pressure on the cake, and then I moved my tip away from the cake to let that line kind of drag down, and then bring it back up. It's kind of like piping a border with royal icing. It's a very similar technique. This is going to help you get really straight and even circles or half circles or lines without having to have a super steady hand. So now that I've piped all of my first half circles, I'm going back with a little more decoration, again trying to fill in that gray space with a second tier of, I don't know what to call these, like non-ruffles half circles, like curtain things. If you have an idea what these are called, let me know in the comments below. But I just want to add in some more space. It makes it look more like a curtain, basically. So I thought it looked pretty cute. Again, you can see my circles are not perfect, but with so much going on, you're never going to notice. And it's time for more decoration. So I'm using an open start tip just to kind of hide the seams where those yellow curtainy things meet. So that way everything looks nice and curtain-like and nice and vintage, and you're not noticing that I have some gaps and some holes. So I thought this looked pretty cute. And then I'm gonna go back and just add a sprinkle to really make the design pop. I didn't want to leave the middle of my cake bare, so I tried to do like a yellow kind of rope border type thing on my cake, and I really wasn't sure how I felt about it. So instead of continuing with that, I decided to do a shell border around the bottom because I knew I knew how to do a shell border, and I knew I wanted this on my cake. And so I'm gonna come back to that rope border design after thinking about it for a couple of minutes. Again, if you're doing a vintage cake and you find a design that you end up not liking, as long as you're working on a cold cake, you can pull that buttercream off the cake and then start again. So if you make a mistake, don't worry. And now to add even more decoration to this cake, I'm just gonna go back and add some yellow dots along the bottom just to give it a little more glitz, a little more glam, just make it look festive and over the top and just overly decorated. So as I'm finishing up my border, I realized I really didn't like all the empty gray space that I had. And this rope border really wasn't that bad. I just had to find the right technique. Which is why I always suggest when you do this, start toward the back of your cake. So every cake has a back if you don't know. And it's usually where your seams are or wherever the case may be. So I try to start everything from the back of my cake. So that way when I get to the front of my cake, I find the right design. And so you notice I will turn my cake to start my shell border, to start my rope border, to start my curtains, all of that I start toward the back of my cake. So that way I can kind of test it out before I get to the front. I am making this cake for myself, so any mess ups I have are totally okay. But I suggest if you're making this cake for someone else that you practice on something that's not the cake. So a piece of parchment or a plate. That way you can 1, practice your design before doing it on the cake, but 2, you also can reuse the icing. Now for the top of my cake, I'm going to use a large leaf tip to make a ruffle pattern border. To pipe this design, just use consistent pressure as you turn the cake and move your hand back and forth to create those large ruffles. I froze this cake for about 10 minutes and then piped a shell border on top. The freezing of this cake is pretty important because if you don't, you're going to end up mixing your yellow and green buttercream and you won't have a nice detailed shell. I found that moving my hand in a bit of a wave instead of the traditional shell pattern gave me a more dramatic shell, which I think paired better with this cake, so that's why I chose this design. My cake is looking good. I'm going to add a few more design elements. So I'm going to add these chocolate pearls, which are colored white. You can get these in a variety of colors. I chose white because I thought white would kind of stand out pretty well and add a bit of drama to this cake. And at this point, you got to go big or go home. So I added some silver pearls in between each of the little yellow rope border little spaces. I'm not sure what to call those either. And so I added those silver pearls again, add some more drama to this cake. I think this cake is all about drama, all about finesse, all about fine details. So that's why I chose to add these extra pearls. I think that's the beauty of these vintage style cakes, that you can be as ornate or as minimalist as you want, and these designs turn out pretty great. So I'm pretty proud of this cake. My last touch, obviously, since it's the new year, is to write 2021 on top, and then voila, here we have our cake. Thank you so much for watching this video and for sticking with me through 2020. If this inspires you to make your own vintage cake, definitely tag me at Baking and Broadway. And if you like this video, you guys know what to do. Hope you guys have a safe and happy new year, and I'll see you guys in the new year.